Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video. In this video I'll be talking about my experience revisiting a series that I've had a pretty rocky relationship with, and that is the Life is Strange series. Now my introduction to this series was obviously with the first game, and when I originally played it I just adored what it tried to do. I mean, telling this coming of age story, touching on the themes of nostalgia, while also having this murder mystery and the sci-fi elements involved in its narrative, and mixing that in with a really likable protagonist in Max Caulfield. I came out of my first playthrough of this game with a very high opinion of it. But through subsequent replays, my opinion of that game slowly deteriorated, and while I do still have a place in my heart for the original game, as the series progressed, I never felt the same level of love that I had for that first game. And really, I can't even say that I enjoy any of the games that came after the first one, but obviously we'll talk about that a bit later. So for this video, I did replay every game in the series, meaning Life is Strange 1, Before the Storm, The Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit, and Life is Strange 2. And that is the order that we'll be talking about them here, so let's get started. So obviously the first game I played in this process was Life is Strange 1, which I already did a video about around the 5-year anniversary of the game, or of episode 5 I should say. So if you want to hear my full thoughts on the first game in extensive detail, go watch that, as at this point I feel like I've talked about everything I could possibly talk about this game. We'll still talk about it here. Obviously a bit more generally though, but as I mentioned earlier, I loved what this game tries to do from a conceptual standpoint. I like the themes it explores. I love the character of Max Caulfield. I like how they handle time travel, both in the narrative and also in the gameplay. I like the murder mystery. But I really found my most recent replay to be the tipping point for me in terms of its flaws. As I've always had a lot of flaws with the game, but I usually just look past them. I really was willing to just ignore them, but during this replay, these things just really stuck out to me. The writing's always been a mess. The dialogue's always been pretty clunky and really just unnatural at points. The voice acting is mediocre at best, and I do think there are so many sections in the game that really just drag out, which makes those particular sections really boring. But with that said, that doesn't mean I don't find any enjoyment from playing this first game. I still think episode 1 is a well-made introduction to the world and characters of Life is Strange. I like the level of exploration involved in this episode, where most of the characters that you can interact with are optional, but if you do them, they lead to potential storylines later down the road. Now, obviously, these are just like side plots that aren't important to the main narrative, but it's still a cool element of the game. It really helps with the world building. I did feel like episode 2 on the replay was a lot slower to me. I never really cared for that diner scene with Chloe. There's a lot of sections in this game that just feel like busy work, that like things that the developers just added into the game just to make it a bit longer. And I really think the Kate Marsh storyline comes off as really heavy-handed here, where I found myself laughing at points at the things that like Kate and Victoria would say instead of really feeling sympathy for Kate. Episode 3 was the episode that took the biggest hit for me on the replay, where I think if you really think about it, the entire episode is pointless. You spend the entire episode investigating with Chloe, and while you do get some information, you do spend most of episode 4 investigating as well. And you get the info from the same sources in that episode, from like David and Frank. So, this episode just feels really pointless. And because I found this pretty boring on the replay, episode 4 is still pretty great in my eyes, but I always hated the alternate reality section, which, I think the alternate reality section is quite possibly the worst section in the entirety of the first game. But the rest of episode 4 is the best content in the entire game. So it's a really hard dichotomy there. And the alternate reality stuff just adds nothing to the overall narrative, and it just really drags on. It's a lot of just watching Max and Chloe talk about things that don't end up mattering. But again, the investigations that lead to the dark room, all that stuff's really great. Finding Rachel in the junkyard is a great scene. The party feels like a culmination of all the side content that's within the game from previous episodes. The ending of the episode is a fantastic cliffhanger, one of the best cliffhangers possibly ever for me. I really just love how they reveal that Jefferson is the mastermind here. And my opinions on the final episode mostly stayed the same. I still don't love how convoluted the time travel elements get in this episode, as it just feels like we're just jumping all over the place. And while there are some great moments within all this, like David's redemption arc, I do like Jefferson as a villain, but I also look at this episode as a lot of wasted potential. As one of my biggest complaints about the first game is how it fails to connect its multiple storylines. I do think the Rachel Amber storyline and the Storm storyline could have been connected by the end of the game, but instead we just get these two separate storylines with no connective tissue outside of them involving the main protagonist and Max. For me, the narrative would have been so much better if Rachel or Jefferson would have turned out to have special powers like Max, as it would make the story feel more whole. But I also never loved the nightmare section in the game, as again, just feels like padding. It serves no purpose to the narrative and just sucks from a gameplay perspective as well. The binary choice at the very end still bothers me. While I do think the sacrifice Chloe ending is pretty strong, but again, the fact that the entirety of the game, this game that supposedly makes your choices matter, is determined by one final choice that negates all of the choices that you made previously is just kind of dumb to me. But overall, for Life is Strange 1, I mean, it just didn't hold up for me as much as I remembered when I first played it. I mean, it is a game that I've played a billion times at this point. I think well over 15 times. I mean, by the time you get to that point, especially on a game that's so narrative focused, I think you are going to start to feel more negative feelings towards the story at that point. But for me, Life is Strange 1 isn't as good as I remembered, but it's certainly better than the games we're about to be talking about. And now let's talk about Before the Storm, which I haven't had the chance to talk about on this channel yet. And I will say, I don't get how there are people out there that actually like Before the Storm. To me, Before the Storm is a travesty of storytelling, not even just individually as a single story, but more so as a prequel to the original Life is Strange. I mean, everything about this game is such a blatant retcon, and it really just makes no sense in conjunction with the first game. It's as if the developers and writers of this game knew the concept of Life is Strange's story without ever having actually played the game themselves, so they miss out on so many of the details, and through that, create a story that makes no sense. And not to mention that this game still has the same fundamental issues of the first game. I mean, there's a lot of messy and clunky writing, terrible voice acting, and it also just strips away the most interesting elements of the original Life is Strange for me. Again, I love the character of Max Caulfield. She's not here. I love the time travel mechanics. There aren't any in this game. I love the themes of nostalgia and the coming of age story that stems from it. And at least nostalgia, that theme isn't really prevalent here. The coming of age story is there, but it's with Chloe, which doesn't really work. I love the investigation over the disappearance of Rachel Amber and the mystery that stemmed from it. That's not here either, obviously. Again, this game comprises of everything I didn't like from the original game in an even worse narrative with a much worse protagonist, and again, a narrative that just makes no sense based on what we've previously seen. There's so many characters that show up in this game that have a major impact on Chloe's life and her character development, but are never mentioned in Life is Strange 1. There's so many relationships that are shown here with characters that do show up in Life is Strange 1 that make no sense. Like Chloe's interactions with Victoria, with Nathan, with Frank are never mentioned in the first game. Really make no sense based on the interactions that we see with them in the first game. Like, why do Chloe and Frank have such a hostile relationship if Frank saved Chloe from being murdered at the end of this game and have this really traumatic experience of dealing with Damon Merrick? Like, all this is not mentioned in the first game. Chloe stands up for Nathan. Like, Nathan is like being bullied in this game. Chloe is sympathetic towards him, but then in the first game it turns out Nathan drugs her, takes pictures of her, and then almost murders her. It's like, what is this? And then Chloe's relationship with Victoria, again, in the first game when we see them together, no interaction at all. Like, we don't have any semblance of them having a relationship. But then in this first game, Chloe's like pranking Victoria at multiple points where she's like drugging her drink and she's like telling her the wrong answers for homework. It's like, why? This is so dumb. Like, none of this makes sense. Chloe's relationship with Rachel Amber and the struggles that go along with that as well, for me, is such a blatant retcon. The storyline about Rachel's parents just feels like something that's so massive that how was that not mentioned in the first game? That was actually something that was planned. I mean, if you go through the episodes, I will say that episodes 1 and 2 as individual stories, without thinking about the blatant retconning, aren't the worst thing in the world. I mean, they're mediocre and really focus on the relationship between Chloe and Rachel, and while I do think there are some good moments between the two, the overall game here just doesn't appeal to me. I really find a lot of it slow. I mean, episode 1 does a decent job at setting up the events of future episodes, but at the same time, what it sets up isn't as strong as the previous game. And again, doesn't make sense in conjunction with the previous game. Episode 2 is definitely the best of the bunch, but again, that's not saying much. I mean, the play scene is really memorable, and the twist ending is interesting, though they kind of ruin it in the next episode. And episode 3 is just a complete disaster. I mean, I just feel like every single narrative decision that they make in this episode is terrible. Everything with Damon Merrick is terrible. It makes no sense how none of this is mentioned in the first game, especially with him shooting Rachel. It's so dumb. And with him being hired by Rachel's father to kill her mom. Again, how is this something that was never brought up? How is this something that's not mentioned? It's so dumb. This entire thing is so dumb. Again, you have Frank killing Damon Merrick. That's really dumb. Everything with Elliot is dumb. I mean, the final decision in the game of whether or not to tell Rachel about what her father did is, again, a major event. Never mentioned outside the context of this story here. Again, it just feels like the writers had no clue what they were doing with the story of this game and didn't even think about what was going on in the first game and like the continuity of what was happening there. So again, for me, I always hated Before the Storm. It really just sucks. But before we move away from Before the Storm, I do still have to talk about the bonus episode, Farewell. And I do love that they did this. I mean, that they created this episode to say farewell to the characters of Max and Chloe, and were able to bring their original voice actors back as well. But the execution here is so bad. I mean, it suffers from the same issues as Before the Storm. While I do think the reveal at the end of the episode that these events are happening immediately before Chloe learns about the death of her father is a cool reveal, but it doesn't make sense. While it's not completely unreasonable, you do have to make some leaps in logic to make this make sense. Based on the original game, we do see the scene where William leaves the house for the final time, meaning that this takes place in between the time that he leaves the house before the police arrive with Joyce. So this story implies that Joyce told Max and Chloe to clean Chloe's room, which obviously could have happened before she went to work. But Max and Chloe talk at the beginning of the episode as if this just happened. We also have the fact that both Max and Chloe are wearing different clothes than what they wear in the scene from the first game, which, I mean, they could have changed clothes, I guess, and wore clothes that they found while cleaning the room. But again, this is not really implied anywhere in the story. Again, this is just something you have to think about to make this story make sense. And just like the rest of Life is Strange, the amount of melodrama in this episode is ridiculous. We spend the entire episode trying to tell Chloe that Max is moving away. And with this happening on the same day that Chloe's dad dies as well, which again, like, isn't mentioned at all in the scene in Life is Strange 1, that this was on Max's mind, but whatever. Again, with this being all the same day that Chloe's dad dies as well, this makes this so much more depressing, with Max literally leaving Chloe on the day of his funeral. And again, this is 1 billion% a retcon. How would they not mention this in the first game if this actually happened in the context of that first game? And again, it's a ridiculous aspect of the story here, with Max just straight up leaving her and not talking to her on Chloe's like lowest moment of her entire life. Like, it's really dumb. It really makes me think that the writers of Before the Storm were really just thinking, like, how are we going to get the most melodrama into the story? Like, without actually thinking about how this connects to the previous game. It's like they completely forget that there's already a previous game full of content that they have to connect. It's like, I mean, it's like they're making individual stories and then making these stories in a way to just add more drama to it without actually thinking about how it affects anything. Because, like, I mean, even as an individual story, it's pretty bad. Like, there's a lot of like really terrible logistical things going on within both Before the Storm and Farewell here. But when we connect it to the first game, it just makes it so much worse. And because of all those reasons, again, Farewell just did not work for me. Again, it's a good concept. I like that they did this final episode of Max and Chloe, but they just ruined it. Now we're moving on to the Life is Strange 2 side of things, starting off with The Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit, which is a free episode introducing us to the world of Life is Strange 2 by allowing us to play as Chris, who ends up becoming a side character in episode 2 of Life is Strange 2, and this happening right before the events of that episode. And for me, Captain Spirit here is fine. The first time I played the game, I found it to be an overall average experience. There's nothing overly wrong with this, unlike the previous games in the series, but I never really found anything that great about it either. It doesn't hit high highs either, and I feel the same way about it after my replay here as well. I don't have much negative to say about it, other than it's still a bit clunky dialogue-wise. I mean, the themes here are probably too blatant. Again, same issues that the previous games have. That being said, though, I do like how they handle the relationship between Chris and his dad. I like how the game acts as a semi-open world with like a checklist of side activities that you can do if you decide to do them, but you don't need to do them to finish the main story of the game. Though I do think if you don't do them, your experience of playing this game is significantly harmed. I mean, I do like how these turn a pretty small-scaled story of a kid just playing around his house into a more grand adventure. Though to be honest, I don't feel like I will ever play Captain Spirit ever again. I don't feel like there's really any incentive to do so, as despite being a prequel to Life is Strange 2, it doesn't really add much or have much of an impact on the story of the main game, especially because Chris and his dad only appear for like the back half of episode 2 and that's it. They don't really do anything. Something I do like is how this episode ends with a cliffhanger that Chris might have superpowers, but I do like how this is handled in the main game, where in the main game it turns out that Daniel saved him, and because of that, deciding on whether or not to tell him the truth becomes a major storyline there. But again, for me, Captain Spirit doesn't really do much wrong, but really, I mean, it doesn't have much time to do much wrong considering it's really short. And at the same time, it isn't given much time to do much right either. I mean, so I really came out of playing Captain Spirit here mostly just unfazed by it. Now for the final game in the series up to this point, we have Life is Strange 2, which I played for the first time towards the beginning of 2020. And here on the replay, I did go for 100% completion and ended up getting the platinum. And I will say that my opinion on the game as a whole is slightly up from when I last played it, but I still don't particularly care for it, especially in comparison to the original game. Like Before Storm, I feel like this game strips away everything I loved from the original game. They got rid of the time travel elements. There is still a coming-of-age story, but one that focuses on pretty radically different themes than the original game. The character Max Caulfield is replaced by Sean, who I don't hate, but I never ended up caring about nearly as much. I just didn't find his and Daniel's stories to be as compelling as Max's. But on the replay, I think I did enjoy the dynamic between Sean and Daniel a bit more, and I feel like the pacing didn't feel as sluggish as I remembered, though it definitely does have its slow points. And the writing is still pretty poor, though the dialogue might actually be a bit better than the previous entries, despite the actual narrative itself being less focused and way less consistent. But we can talk about the episode, starting with episode 1. I actually didn't mind episode 1. I remember seeing people talk about how it's a slow start, but I actually didn't mind much of this episode. I enjoyed the portion where we get to see Sean's normal life. We get to explore his house and talk to Lila and Daniel and his dad, but then we get to the scene where like Esteban gets killed. I found this scene to be kind of dumb. It's like every character involved in the scene does something completely illogical, and everything here could have just been avoided in a real life scenario, but whatever. I did find the sections where Sean and Daniel are on their own in the woods to be really slow, both in this episode and episode 2 as well. But we eventually reach a convenience store where Sean gets captured, and this was another point where they got really heavy-handed with the themes on racism, and I just found this to be really over the top. I liked Brody as a character, but I felt like this leads to another one of my issues with the story, is how this game constantly introduces and then tosses away characters over and over and over again, despite the characters that it leaves behind being some of the more interesting characters in the game. Episode 2 was a slower episode for me, where it starts off with Sean and Daniel being alone in the woods, but eventually they reach Beaver Creek, and that's where most of the episode takes place. I mean, this section was okay. There was some mystery being set up about what's in their mother's childhood bedroom. It's like that really leads to nothing. We do get to the events of Captain Spirit, and I do like the subplot that stems from it. Though again, I felt like Chris didn't really get much to do in the story as a whole. Episode 3 is probably my favorite of the bunch, as I feel like it's the one that's the most focused narratively. I feel like a whole bunch of these episodes just go all over the place without having like a solid through line. Like episode 3 here is very focused. It comprises of Daniel and Sean's adventures on the pot farm and dealing with Meryl, and we get a batch of new characters to meet, and also some recurring characters from episode 2, like Finn and Cassidy, who, while I didn't love them as characters, I did like the coming of age element of the story here that did stem from how these characters interacted with Sean and Daniel. And well, overall, this is a mostly unimportant episode. Really, all you need to know is that Sean gets injured and taken by the police while Daniel escapes elsewhere. That's really the only thing you need to know from this episode. I do feel like a lot of the interactions as the characters really make up for that. Episode 4 is still probably my least favorite of the bunch. During my original playthrough, I found this one to be extremely boring, and even though I did like it a bit more here, I did find it relatively slow still. The entire hospital section really drags out for me, of trying to find a way to escape and having to use Joey to help get you out. The following section of Sean being assaulted by a couple of racists is again really heavy-handed in its execution. We spend the rest of the episode rescuing Daniel from a cult, which just felt weird. And this just felt like a side plot that was really just there to pad out the game. Which, really, if you really want to think about it, that's pretty much the entirety of episodes 3 and 4. Both of these episodes could have just been cut out. You can literally jump from episode 2 to episode 5 and the story would still make sense. The end of the episode where you rescue Daniel is really just ridiculous, though. I did find it kind of entertaining. So at least there's that. Episode 5 was another mixed episode for me where I found everything at the Hermit Town to be pretty slow outside of the appearance of David Madsen, which I found really random. I was not expecting that at all, but I did like how he connects obviously this game to the original game, as outside of this, and there was the appearance of Arcadia Bay in episode 1, there really isn't much connective tissue between the two games, but I did enjoy the segment at the border. Again, the writing here is pretty heavy-handed, but I did enjoy Daniel breaking into the jail, and I did like how we did get a bevy of different endings to this game. In my original playthrough, I had Sean turn himself in. I got the ending where Daniel is there when Sean gets out of jail. And on my most recent playthrough, I got the ending where both Sean and Daniel make it to Puerto Lobos, and I liked how the morality system worked and how it's handled in this game. It really does make it feel like your choices matter. Again, that's one of my biggest issues of the first game, is that while it preaches that your choices matter, none of those really end up mattering because the final decision in the game dictates the rest of the story. While in this game, it's a bevy of decisions that you make through your relationship with Sean and Daniel that really dictate which ending you get. And because there are so many of them, I do look at this part of the game as a pretty big step up for the franchise. But overall for me, Life is Strange 2, I still find it to be extremely inconsistent. I did enjoy my most recent playthrough more than my original, but I still don't look at it as a great game or one that I had a particularly great experience with. I just found myself bored during a good chunk of the game, and while it doesn't have as many laughably bad moments like the previous games, it isn't as poorly written as Before the Storm in the sense that at least there's a story that makes sense. Though a bit ridiculous, obviously, but again, it still makes sense. So for me, it's definitely better than Before a Storm, but really, almost anything is better than Before a Storm. But the game as a whole still doesn't fully work for me, especially in comparison to the first game. So that is every game in the Life is Strange series. I do still have a special place in my heart for the original game, no matter how bad the writing is and how certain points of the game can be pretty boring. No matter what, I will always find it to be better than the games that have followed it so far. Again, Before a Storm is a travesty of storytelling where it's pretty clear that the writers had no sense of continuity between the two games, which is, again, completely asinine when you're making a prequel. And even as an individual game, it strips everything I liked about the original one. The Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit is an extremely inoffensive game, largely due to how short and pointless it is. And then Life is Strange 2 has many of the faults of the previous games in the series and never really connected to me as much as the original, despite probably technically being better in most aspects. So those are my opinions on the individual games in the Life is Strange series after my latest replay. Obviously more videos are coming, so stay tuned for those, but for now, thank you for watching.